Many medicines used to treat colds and flu contain acetaminophen, a pain reliever and fever reducer found in hundreds of over-the-counter and prescription medicines. But taking too much or more than one medication containing acetaminophen per day can damage your liver. So always read the label and don't take acetaminophen if you drink 3 or more alcoholic drinks every day. To learn more, visit fda.gov/OTC pain info. A message from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Food and Drug Administration.
Today's episode of Doobie Date with Dr. Nikki is sponsored by Treating Suicidal Clients and Self-Harm Behaviors, Assessments, Workshops, and Guides for Interventions and Long-Term Care. This book is by Dr. Megan in Houston. If you want more information on this book, follow the links provided in our description of this podcast. Welcome. You're listening to Doobie Deep with Dr. Nikki. This is the place where witty, irreverent, opinionated perspective meets serious, fact-based discussion. Featuring our host, Dr. Nikki Coleman, and her co-host, Tomas Bell. You can also join in the discussion during our live tapings by following us on Spreaker.com. Now, the doctor is in. It's time to get Doobie Deep.
Hello, hello, hello. And welcome back to Season 3 of Doobie Deep with Dr. Nikki and my illustrious, always thirsty, meant in both the actual and colloquial phrasing of that term, Tomas. Hello,
Is this really
Tomas.
how you want to start Season 3?
Of course,
Is that really
because
how you want to do it?
we value authenticity here at Doobie Deep with Dr.
I
Nikki.
am not authentically thirsty. Well...
Say it ain't so.
You know me too well.
No, to be honest, like you really are like maybe the anti-thirst. Like you are the least thirsty person. You don't really be bothered pretty much too much with nobody.
I don't be in these streets like that. You know how it is. I pay too much for Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon Prime. What I need to be in the streets for.
All of the comforts of home are
That's right.
Home.
There's a liquor store down the street from my block. I got everything I need right here at home.
Oh my goodness, I can't with you. How are you doing though? What's been going on? How are you?
You know, it's been an interesting break we've had. There's always, I feel like there's always something going on. I feel like every time something happens, I'm like, wow, I wish we were doing the podcast this week. And
I know.
Yeah, it's personally, I think I'm fine, but it's just so much going on.
It is. It is a lot going on. It's a lot going on. It's a lot to keep up with. Right. Where to begin. But breaks are good. So we ended in May. Was it May? I can't even remember. No, end of April.
Yeah, it was April.
Yeah, so it's been about 6 weeks. And that was good. I needed to attend to some things, shift some focus, and I'm ready to come back fresh. And that's the perfect segue. You mentioning how much is always going on. There are so many things that are always happening. You know, one of the goals that we have here with this podcast is to take some time to be reflective and thoughtful about dialoguing about the things happening that may not be necessarily affecting us directly, but have an impact on us all collectively. And that's why, even though I'm excited to be back, I recognize that today's topic is not the most fun or sunniest topic for us to come back with. It's actually a bit heavy, but I think it's important and unfortunately also timely. And we want to talk about suicide today. So the title of this episode is #EndTheStigma. In specific, we're talking about ending the stigma around talking about suicide. I would extend that to think about ending the stigma in terms of talking about depression, about mental health, about needing help. So we want to use our time to kind of look a little bit more closely at that topic. What makes it timely is that just last week there were 2 notable suicide cases that made the world news because the individuals who chose that as a way of ending their own mental anguish and pain were prominent celebrities. So last week, in 1 week, actually, we lost Kate Spade. So a well-known female designer, fashion designer. And I would also add business person to that. So I think a lot of the notoriety around Kate Spade and her brand was around her business savvy and her perseverance as a woman in business. And then Anthony Bourdain, who I will be quite honest, I wasn't personally that. I knew who he was, but I wasn't a fan, I would say. I didn't watch his shows. I didn't really know the depth of how he used his platform as a journalist to talk about marginalized communities, to shed light on difficult topics through the avenue of food. And so I have found at least in my circle, that his death also had a huge impact on folks, and that it's a loss that's really been felt keenly by folks. On the other side of that, though, is I think that both of their deaths have sparked a lot of conversation. They've sparked conversation about what depression is and what isn't. They've sparked conversation about suicidality, who is affected by suicide and who isn't. And there's been lots of other conversation, too, about how to help those around you if you suspect someone might be considering suicide. And I wanted to do the podcast on it because I think it is such an important topic. But also, I saw and heard a lot of things that were helpful. And then I also saw and heard some things that weren't so helpful. So we wanted to put a little bit more emphasis on thinking through and talking about, kind of informing you all about what are the stats around suicide? What does it look like? What are some myths associated with it, and what we can do as individuals who may be struggling out there ourselves with the depths of depression and considering suicide, or for those who we might have in our world, in our intimate circles that we may be concerned about. So that's what we want to do with the podcast today. Tomas, where are you in all of this conversation? What was your experience around the recent suicides? What are you hearing in your world? And are people talking about this in the same way that I mentioned, or no?
They are. And I know that's so dramatic.
Right. They are. And I'm waiting.
Yeah, I know.
How?
So, no, I'm just trying to think how I want to approach this topic, because it's personal for many different reasons. Mm-hmm. I've known people who have attempted suicide. Mm-hmm. I know people with mental illness, and then there are people who you don't know who affect you sometimes. I'm thinking specifically of a story where I was sitting with a client and we're talking about voice work, and then he gets a call and finds out one of his best friends had killed himself. Mm-hmm. And he just saw the guy the week before. Mm-hmm. And like literally we're just sitting out drinking and laughing, and the guy was talking about planning to go someplace and do something, and they were planning on doing things together, and it was this whole thing, and he just broke down in front of me, and I had no idea what to do. See, in that moment, all the life coaching in me meant nothing. Because how do you really support someone who's in that space when you're confronted with it? And so when reflecting on these other things, it got me thinking, so I didn't know how to support someone who lost someone. What if someone came to me or didn't, and I happened upon someone who was seriously contemplating that? How do you support that person? Yeah,
there's a couple things that I hear in that story that I think are so true across across a lot of people's experiences around being close to suicide. And one of those, and this was one of the things that came out over and over and over again as being similar across Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade is that the people most close in their lives talked a lot about how they didn't see this coming, right? Like they thought that they thought both of them were kind of in, to be trite, like in the prime of their lives, right? So that you would talk about this person's friend being able to have a good time and being out and being social and making plans for the future just in a short time period before. I think that is not an uncommon experience. So that people can be walking around and appear perfectly fine and internally be dealing with a lot of mental and emotional turmoil. And that reaches a crux for some folks in which, ending the pain becomes the bigger goal and the brighter alternative than continuing to try to struggle through it. And so it does leave folks. So let me say this. I think grief is hard in any set of circumstances. And we also know grief is complicated when it's unexpected. And then I think for suicide, there's a particular, what would be the word? Discomfort, sensitivity, and maybe even painfulness associated with the grief because of that feeling that you just talked about is, well, what do you do, right? If somebody is at that place, what do you say? What do you do to provide them with words of comfort or alternative ways of seeing things or expectations of hope that might keep them from making that irreversible decision? And I think that's where some of the stigma comes in. It's kind of like we don't want to talk about suicide because it's such an ugly outcome of our human experience. And that I think sometimes there's a little bit of a worry about like contamination, right? Or like, I don't want to kind of go there because I don't know like what might be on the other side if I open up this conversation with this person. Or a little bit of worry of like, if I actually say the word out loud, is that going to make this more real and viable for the other person? And neither one of those things are true.
Can I add another piece to that?
Yeah.
I think sometimes that people who do have the conversation often come from the wrong place in their conversation. If a friend of mine,
what's the wrong place?
So if a friend of mine, if I knew or got wind of or felt that they were contemplating suicide, the conversation shouldn't be wrapped around my loss and you're being selfish and what you're doing to me. And oftentimes I hear when people say, oh, that's so selfish. You just killed yourself. Oh, you're just weak. You're a loser. Well, those aren't exactly encouraging, empathetic, or supportive ways of dealing with that subject. So
I'm going to just take exactly off of that and be like, those are not, right? So you're right in talking about like what you don't want to do in that situation. Those are the things that are, those are not motivators.
Absolutely.
Those are not motivators to stop someone.
Even let's not even talk about suicide. Let's talk about death itself. We approach death as our own personal loss. Like, that when Prince died, I was sad about it, right? But the question there were people who were like sad, like their lives were over, like it was like. Thing. And the same thing with Anthony Bourdain, Kate Spade. When you think about those people who are affected so deeply, the question is, what is the loss they're actually dealing with? Their own personal loss and how that person affected them, or the fact that this person didn't get support and wasn't able to make a choice that would have benefited their lives even better. And so maybe crafting a conversation that doesn't involve our own ego when speaking to someone, we could potentially save some lives. It's just a thought.
I take a different tact on that. I hold the belief that grief is always for the living. That grief in and of itself is always a selfish enterprise. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean it for me. It's a very factual way. Like we are